Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us for the third lecture in the series, Ancient Roots, Judaism and Ancient Christianity. I'm Chava Terror Samuelson. I'm a Regents Professor of History. I'm also Irving and Miriam Lowe Professor of Modern Judaism and the Director of the Center for Jewish Studies at Arizona State University. If you have attended our previous online events, you know that the Center for Jewish Studies at Arizona State is committed to disseminating knowledge about Jews and Judaism through guest lectures, research conferences, adult education courses, and historical exhibits. Since the beginning of the pandemic, we have offered a robust program of online public lectures covering many aspects of Jewish history, religion, and culture. In the previous semester, we held a research conference on Jewish-Muslim relations through the ages. We also had 3 lecture series, one on religion and science, one on thinking through literature after Auschwitz, and one on Jewish genealogy. And the lectures featured both ASU faculty as well as scholars from other universities. We started the spring semester with a series of 3 lectures on the rabbis that shaped Jewish history, and it was taught by Professor Stanley Mervis. And in addition, we hosted Professor Pamela Nadell from American University as our Eckstein Scholar in Residence. Her lecture focused on Jewish women and the feminist revolution. The current lecture series, Ancient Roots, Judaism and Ancient Christianity, has featured Professor Blake Hartung, who explored Judaism and Christianity as textual communities framed by the interpretation of the Bible. And last week, Professor Françoise Mirguet examined the historical and cultural conditions that brought about the differentiation between these two communities, creating what we know as Judaism and Christianity. I want to thank all the faculty members who have participated in these lectures. And I want to give special thanks to Lisa Kaplan and Dawn Beeson, the staff of the Center for Jewish Studies, who have done all the logistical work as well as the marketing and the publicity that made these lectures and these events possible. This evening, I have the pleasure of introducing Professor Timothy Langille, who is a lecturer in Jewish Studies and Religious Studies at ASU. Professor Langille grew up in Edmonton, Alberta, and got his BA in 2007 and MA in 2009 from the University of Alberta. Then he moved on to the University of Toronto, where he got his PhD in the study of religion and Jewish studies in 2014. After teaching at the University of Toronto, University of Pittsburgh, and Middle Tennessee State University, Professor Langille joined ASU in 2016. What's unique about his work is the fact that he combines specialization in biblical studies as well as specialization in Holocaust and genocide studies. And that combination is quite unusual. And the answer, or kind of the rationale for that combination, is that he focuses on responses of Jews to trauma, and he explores how trauma has shaped Jewish memory and Jewish collective identity. He has published various essays on trauma, on memory, and Jewish responses to catastrophe during the Second Temple period, on genocide in Antiquity, on memory and the Jewish Legion during World War I, and on performance of Purim plays in post-Holocaust DP camps. I believe that lecture was actually, he shared some of it with us in 2020. So he's currently working on a book manuscript on genocide in Antiquity. At ASU, he teaches various courses on the Hebrew Bible, survey courses on Jewish history and Jewish civilization, and upper-level undergraduate and graduate courses on comparative genocide. So he also participated over the years in various seminars that focus on methodology and pedagogy of Holocaust studies, genocide studies, and Jewish studies. So tonight, his lecture is going to be under the title Identities and Categories in Jewish Antiquity. And that would help us understand the kind of the social makeup of this community in which people, it wasn't really clear who is a Jew and what's the difference between a Jew and Gentile, or who is a Jew and what makes one a Jew as much as what makes one a Christian. All those issues were pretty fluid at the time that we're trying to understand. After his presentation, Dr. Blake Hartung and Françoise Mirguet will engage Dr. Langille with questions, and then we will open it up to the audience with question and answers. Please put it at the Q&A function rather than at the chat, if you please. And I will now mute myself and turn off my video camera so we can all listen to Dr. Langille. Tim, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Professor T. Roche Samuelson, for the generous introduction. Thank you, everyone, for attending here this Wednesday night. And if you've been attending the other two fantastic presentations, the bar has been set very high by my colleagues, Professors Hartung and Mirguet. As my students would say, they brought the heat, they brought some ancient world heat. And yes, and I look forward to trying to live up to what they've, the bar that they've established in the first two talks. So an outline for this evening, just so you can follow along. I do think I have too much content, so I might have to bounce forward for time purposes. I'm going to talk a bit about Jewish identities, and as the title of this talk is, ancient categories, Jews and what Jew and Christian means in antiquity, which is based on the relationship between religion and ethnicity, which we'll talk about when we get a word called religio in the 4th century, and how that plays out in some of the scholarship. And what I'm going to be doing as well, my colleagues did incisive primary source reading and analysis. I'm going to be doing more of a survey of the field and what's going on in some of these conversations. So also looking at how boundaries are actually constructed with the proximate other. These aren't ultimate others, as we'll see. How messy and fluid, as Dr. T. Roche Samuelson just said, Judaism and Christianity were at this time, and that we saw that as well in Professor Mirguet and Hartung's presentations. And because, as you heard in my introduction, that I have an affinity for bringing together the ancient world and modernity or contemporary issues, I'm going to introduce you to a conversation from 2014 that some of the best scholars in the field had with in the Marginalia Review of Books called The Jew and Judean. It's a forum on politics and historiography and translation of ancient texts. And this debate goes around what's most appropriate to use, in the 1st century or antiquity, Jew or Judean. And there are some contemporary issues with this, like anti-Semitism. And, so this is an interesting debate, and maybe I'll just pop this in the chat box, or I'll do that after. So you can access this, you can read all these entries, and it's a pretty engaging debate, I find. I often use it in my classes, especially one I'm teaching right now, which is the Bible to 1492. So we, get a handle of our terminology and our categories here. And yeah, what are contemporary implications for ancient categories? So this is something I'm going to bring up a couple times in this talk. 21st century Jewish identity and 1st century Jewish identity, they're not the same things, but they're both very complicated, as is the terminology religion, right? Anybody who's taken a religious studies class, we like debating what religion is, what it's not. And so, who's a Jew? What's a Jew? Is it a religious demarcator, signifier, ethnicity, culture, heritage, nation? It can be all of them. And how do we, classify this? And, there are complexities in ancient and modern classifications, as I always try to tell my students in Intro to Jewish Civ or Intro to Judaism, like, you can't essentialize Jews ever, like 1st century, antiquity, now. And, I think there is some, analogies we can draw between ancient and modern classifications and, some of the definitions and identity issues we have with terms like Jew and religion. So I'm going to give a brief survey of the field, hopefully going to keep it brief because I do want to get to that debate. So as I said, there's an ongoing debate about when it's most appropriate to start using Jew in antiquity. Yehudi from Esther, heard that one before. Shia Cohen with Judaismos, which, some people will translate as Judaism, others Judaizing. Saw this transform in the Hasmonean period. The Hasmoneans were the successors to the Maccabees, but this actually went from an ethnic geographic marker to a religious one. As I'll outline with some of the scholarship, Judean is usually thought to be like an ethnic geographic marker, in Judaism, a religious one. But it's much more complicated than that. And, Judeoi, where is that Jews rather than Judeans? And, this is based on, a change of citizenship and converting neighbors. I'm not going to get into it right now. The Hasmoneans were converting neighbors, to save themselves, actually, or some scholars think. Steve Weitzman's got a great essay on that, about how they fell out of favor with Jews, and to crush the resistance, they had to bring in neighbors, and citizenship and conversion, and these stories of forced circumcision. I'm not going to get into that. That's kind of beyond the scope of what I'm doing tonight. But here's Cohen's book, The Beginning of Jewishness. I'm just going to look at the emboldened part here. And I will have a bibliography for everyone, because I know some people were asking for that last week, and Professor Merguez preempted that nicely. So I do have some sources and citations here, but I will also have a bibliography that can be shared with the audience here. So Cohen, as you can see, argues that under the influence of the Hellenistic culture and the politics of the Hasmoneans, refashioned the Judean state into a league that would allow the incorporation of non-Judeans. At more or less the same time, the progression from ethnicity to religion had advanced to the point where individual Gentiles who came to believe in the God of the Jews were accepted as Jews themselves. So that's one position. Admittedly, I'm not part of that school. I do think that's it's a bit early for my liking, but this is what the Q&A is going to be for. And I've got my wonderful colleagues on here who are masters of this period. So, ethnic boundaries, one thing I would say, markers, they're fluid, constantly under negotiation, and adapting or having overlap with identity markers of a proximate other, whether it's a neighbor, Idumean, does not equate to a religious conversion. And I imagine both of my colleagues will have much to say about this very complex relationship between religion and ethnic identity, because we don't have a word for religion at this time, but things that we would call religion is part of like an ethnos, ethnic identity in antiquity. And in fact, Flavius Josephus, famous for Jewish war and prolific writer and Against Apion, tells us that ethnicities have a homeland, a lawgiver, laws, ancestral customs, sacred text, priest, aristocrats, and a citizenship. So, you can see some of that, phenomena there is what we would call religion today. So Second Maccabees is also an important text because, again, I want to bring a context for this Jew versus Judean debate I'm going to introduce you to at the second half of this talk. Second Maccabees, it's not going to get into the dating. It could be anywhere between 124 and 63 BCE. They have this dichotomous relationship between Judaismos and Hellenismos, right? What usually are translated as Judaism and Hellenism. It's dichotomous in the text, but it is also a text written in Greek with Greek tropes. It reads much more like Greek historiography than what we get the historiography in the Hebrew Bible. They're written in Greek, and the Hasmoneans themselves, successors of the Maccabees, presented themselves as, Jewish and Hellenistic leaders. So it's not as dichotomous as scholarship used to think. But this is a text that sets these up. And what's important about this as well is that, it's creating identity against something, where I'm going to get into that with, some scholars think that this is when we get Judaism, when it gets created in opposition to, or as a foil to Christianity. And we can see something similar with, Judaism and Hellenism, right? And there's debate, again, what this word means, Judaismos. What do we, Steve Mason's going to call it Judaizing. Others will, translate it as Judaism. And, the text tells us Judas and his brothers, they fought bravely, for Judaismos. And Hellenismos is used in, quoting Eric Gruen here in 3 different places. And it was with the, Hellenizing of Jerusalem with the high priest and the gymnasium and the Greek practices. And Steve Mason just thinks Judaismos is a reaction to Hellenismos, right? That it's this, we wouldn't have this word if it wasn't for the other. And so here's Steve Mason, also a Canadian, was at York University while I was doing my doctorate in Toronto, but is now in the Netherlands, as you can see. And this is an article that really influenced me in grad school. And I was seduced by it, drank the Kool-Aid, whatever way we want to put that, because I read this, and as a grad student, being a typical grad student, like, oh yeah, this is the coolest thing ever. He's totally right. And in fact, my dissertation shows that a little bit. And however, I do think differently now. I don't agree with Mason per se, but Mason's striving for precision of language and antiquity, right? That for him, you can see Judaoi or Judeans. There was no alternative because, as he points out, the Greco-Roman world had no category for religion at this time. No isms denoting religious allegiance, no Judaism. And the rare, as you can see, Judaismos for him is Judaization, was usable only in the special context of the movement toward or away from Judean law. So this would be in response to Hellenismos. That is why the term is hardly ever used. Judaismos is a belief system, a way of life, as a concept abstracted from the realities of Judea, Jerusalem, etc. And, this was basically, the construction until, we get, Christianismos in the 3rd and 5th century. So, Mason would be one who's striving to be like, I'm going to be very particular with language. I want to use the language that I think the ancients used. And I'll give some other examples here, and also doesn't think that there is a Judaism until we have a term called religio in the, at least the, 4th century, in that once we get something called Judaism, it is created, from Christianity's opposition to it. So just, kind of summarizing this, for him, there's no Judaism in the classical sense, following Neusner. And some people have asked, like, what do you do with Philo of Alexandria? The great philosopher, retold biblical narratives and allegory, and important source for the pogroms against the Jews in 38 through 41 CE in Alexandria. And, because this is someone who lived in Alexandria, this is a Greek-speaking community, right? And, someone like Mason would be like, well, you probably can be an Egyptian and a Judean and a citizen of Alexandria. Draws, off of our homeland here. We Canadians really like hyphenating ourselves. I grew up calling myself a Ukrainian Canadian all the time. That's, this is how we spoke. But like, he points out that you can be an Indo-Canadian or a Chinese Canadian, that, it does not cause us to fall back upon religion or something else, right? Because, Philo was, something that first came to mind when I read this article years ago, like, well, does this fit this model? So, what is ethnicity and antiquity? Because this is important as well. You can see here, I'll add this to the bibliography, Jonathan Hall's Hellenicity, between ethnicity and culture. And ethnos, like ethnicity in the Greco-Roman world, was much a matter of customs as place of origins, an ethnic, but not purely religious self-definition. And, and even though we got a word ethnos, but not a word for religion at this time, I will add that the way ethnicity is talked about in antiquity and today are very, very different things as well. So, and just while I'm got this idea in mind, someone who also works on genocide, right? We don't have a term for that before 1944 with Raphael Lemkin, but genocides existed. That was Lemkin's work, wondering why people did this to themselves all throughout time, right? And he was very much influenced by the Armenian genocide, which took place before the term was coined. So I don't always think you need a term coined for something to exist. Maybe that's something we can think about in the Q&A. But quoting Hall, what an ethnic identity in antiquity is, it's the fact that the symbols in which it draws revolves around notions of fictive kinship and descent, common history, and a specific homeland. And I know, and I'm sure Professor Merguez will as well. I know Professor Hartung has some ideas about this. We spoke earlier today, but this is Christians and Jews absolutely would share this to the point where, some Romans like Celsus and Julian would be like, well, why, like with the so-called parting of ways, like, what are you doing? Why are you giving up, this? Because like the more ancient you were, the better too, right? In this context. And, I think, the Romans were a bit mystified because Christians really did create this new hybrid identity, which I'll get to momentarily. But, these are things like when we talk about use this kind of definition for ethnicity in antiquity, that Jews and Christians absolutely share that. So continuing with this religion and, ethnicity, ethnos, Josephus, and this is an argument Mason will use, right, in against Apion, which, it's a polemical text. But Josephus is also trying to show Greeks, Babylonians, everyone else, Spartans who are known for their law, like, hey, we're ancient too. Like we can up you on all these things. Like Spartans, you think you're great with the law? You should check out Moses, right? So, this was a, kind of a showcase of one's ethnicity and culture, right? But when Josephus is doing this comparing and contrasting, it's to other ethnic, right? This is Babylonians, Egyptians, Chaldeans, Athenians, Spartans, but, and Mason would say these do not approximate to religion. Like he is comparing this term, Judaismos, to that it equates to, it's an equivalent to Babylonians, Egyptians, Chaldeans, like, Neo-Babylonian, Athenians, and Spartans. So, and again, for Josephus, each of these have a homeland, lawgiver, ancestral customs, sacred texts, priests, and, this is what we call religion today. And when I get to the Jew versus Judean debate, I'm very much in line with Annette Yoshiko Reed, who Professor Merguez mentioned last week, and she's an absolutely fantastic scholar, but does raise this issue with, we don't only just struggle with the concept of religion in antiquity, we absolutely do in modernity as well. So just to give you an idea of what this field is looking like as well, Professor Merguez mentioned Judith Liu last week, and Judith Liu is fantastic. Neither Jew nor Greek, and Professor Hartung and I were talking about this today, right? That's how Christians saw themselves. Like they drew off of everything. They were neither Jew nor Greek, and they created, what some call like a third race, or, this hybrid identity by just drawing off all these identity markers around them, right? And Professor Merguez did speak last week as well about the parting of ways, which this is what the scholarship is here, right? The Christian scholarship on the parting of ways with, and and this is going to make more sense when I get to the end of this presentation about kind of the ethics, and the historian's task is not to be neutral, right? And maybe that could be a critique of Mason, just trying to be like, it's going to represent everything it is in the ancient world. But, the scholarship, the Christian scholarship on it has traditionally been anti-Semitic with some negative vitriolic caricaturing images. And I will show you one now deceased New Testament scholar who absolutely did that. And, Judith Liu would be like, we got responsibility to the past, present, and future. And this is going to lead up to the Jew versus Judean debate, especially the scholars who are like, I'm worried about the disappearing Jew from Antiquity and, how our translations may or may not influence contemporary anti-Semitism. So, and another question too is, texts. We've talked a lot about texts, and a lot of them can be polemical. And do texts map onto reality? These social interactions, encounters seem to be much more fluid and dynamic and complicated than some of the polemics we get out of texts. And again, throwing back to 2 Maccabees, you would think that they don't like Greeks per se, but it does actually mention a whole bunch of Greeks that they do like in the text. And also it is absolutely such a Greek text as well that it really complicates it. And so, if we're talking about Judaism and Christianity being anachronistic, like how do we discuss this in Antiquity, right? And sometimes when we search for these hard myth of origins, like trying to seek these myth of origins, that this is a firm starting point with this, I think we can run into some problems. And Professor Merguez nicely articulated last week Daniel Boyarin's borderlines, right, with the wave theory, and just how fluid. And we've talked about Judaism and Christianity being conjoined twins, right? This is not it's an intimate, complicated relationship. And in the diversity and fluidity, we might lose sometimes searching for these myths of origins. And I know when I started studying this stuff way back in Antiquity, or in fact, my Antiquity back in undergrad, Christian origins was the term always used, and that's not a term used so much anymore. So, with Liu points out, as others do, that Judaism became Christianity's proximate other, right? Again, this is othering someone, but people very close to us. And again, the continuity, the fluid interrelationship. And we talked a bit during Professor Hartun's talk about the Judeo-Christian, right? And this being a recent development, and it also shows similarity and difference, right? They can be detached and reconnected, right? And we need to ask, how did ancient writers themselves use these categories, describe themselves, represent themselves? And I do want to return to that point again with like early Christianity, or whatever term we want to use for that. Jesus movement, there's they didn't have, it really drew off this Jewish ethnic identity, but created this new thing, these new parameters, again, fashioning this third race. And neither Jew nor Greek, but it's drawing off of both, right? So how much can you actually really separate those things? So continuing with Liu, I want to point out as well that as Professor T. Rowe Samuelson mentioned in the introduction, and I've been trying to establish here as well, that there really is no universal meaning to these categories: Roman, Greek, Christian, barbarian, Jew, Christian. I've got Christian twice. And, again, if we think back to, Boyarin from last week, the conjoined twins, that wave theory, right? How waves wash over each other, and, whether it's throwing 2 stones into the water and having the waves go over each other, arguably you could just say it's 1 stone thrown in the water at this point. And, and just these continuities and discontinuities, right? To and the interactions with each other's past. Like, we can't just, break these things up and just be like, here's the separation. And as you can see from this quote at the end, this final point on this slide from Lou, if Judaism and Christianity, if not already Christians and Jews, are implicated in the construction of each other, then how can we speak of the parting of them? Right? And it goes back to these shared symbols, these porous but boundaries that can become firm, right? But, very much drawing off of similar traditions. Okay. One thing I do want to point out as well, and maybe my colleagues can speak a bit more to this, because I really am not a New Testament scholar. I haven't taught New Testament since Pittsburgh in 2014. But, the term Christian only appears 3 times in the New Testament, because sometimes, I think in a popular sense, sometimes we see it that, especially with, supersessionism, like the New Testament came and that's it. Like, this is this firm breaking or separation. But, the word Christian only appears 3 times, and, kind of in derogatory ways, right? With outsiders stating this. And once we get outside the text too, our epigraphy and archaeology, show that there's a lot more in common, right? That these, we got to be careful with these polemical texts, right? They, they show much more fluidity and shared identity, and, boundaries they're not binary. Like, they're locations of negotiation and interaction, right? And, when we try to draw these firm lines between these categories, whether you're going to agree with Steve Mason or someone else, I don't think that really represents what's going on, or, it speaks to the social worlds that we have under scrutiny during this 3-part series on ancient roots. I'm not going to get into this because my wonderful colleague, Professor Merguet, covered this nicely about the, but the parting of ways being more like an encounter than a parting, right? And this, this aligns with what I just showed you with Judith Liu's scholarship. And I know we've had this conversation, and I think Professor T. Rose Samuelson introduced this on the first night in the introduction, right? That this is not something because this used to be a model, and Professor Merguet covered these models nicely, that, these are not, Judaism's not the mother of Christianity, that they're conjoined twins. And I've mentioned the wave theory a couple times, but I'll just keep this moving. So I might have some questions myself for my panelists here, especially those who've got more specialization in Christianity around this time. I kind of, after Josephus, I start tailing off a bit in the ancient world, but Ignatius, right? Ignatius with, martyred in Rome, coins the term Christianismos. It's a foil to Judaismos, right? And so you can see that this is, and scholars will draw off of this, and that it gets heightened, 3rd and 4th century, especially when we get the word religio, that, Judaism is something coined by Christians or how we would translate this word as Judaism is in opposition, and again, a foil to Christianity. But what was Christianity? Christianity's pretty messy at this point too. It didn't really fit well. Like, this is what I mean. I think we can't put these people and these movements and these groups into boxes, right? And Christianity is a perfect example of that, right? As I said, we get the term religio, which call religion in the 4th century CE. But Christianity drew off of everything, right? This Jewish ethnic past, but also, in the Roman world, it fit with civic cults and philosophies and, voluntary associations, which would be very different than an ethnos, right? And, it's what we'd later identify as religion, And Christianity resembled cults and collegia, like these, legal entities more than an ethnicity, right? And, Jews weren't compared to these categories, but, non-Christians, Romans were kind of, mystified in some ways, but, it approximated to these cults and these voluntary associations, while also drawing off of what we call like the Jewish ethnos. And I've always found this very creative. I'm not an expert in this. I learned this in grad school pretty well, taught it a few times. I've not published in this area, but I've always found this really interesting how, and again, Professor Hartung and I were discussing this today, and maybe he can speak to this a bit more, just like how creative Christianity got with like cobbling together this identity that doesn't really, there's none of these boxes Christianity fits in, and neither do Jews. And even the Romans, had struggled a bit with, distinguishing between Jews and Christians. Galen, talked about the irrationality of the schools of Moses and Christ. Celsus, grouped them together and criticized them both. They were seen as isolated, parochial, was problematic, not participating in the imperial cult, right? And the Romans did absolutely recognize that they shared, this ethnic identity with, shared scripture, memories, ideas, Abrahamic descent, homeland. And quoting Mason, Christianismos was itself a new and hybrid kind of group, which drew off of elements from the ethne, cults, philosophy, collegia, magic systems. It was also initially a household, tradition. All right, let's see for time. Okay, this is a more recent article that I'll have on the bibliography for you, and I do have PDFs too that I'm happy to share with people if people are inclined to email me. But just, this was a recent publication in Current Biblical Research, right? Kind of just, stating what I've been stating, right? That conceptualizing Judaism, Christianity, and antiquity of religions also risk anachronism. Since ancient religion was bound with ethnicity, people had their deities, practices. There was not much Judaism as there were Jews, or some would say Judeans, as Mason tells us. And, to a degree, we can speak of Judaism. Several scholars contend that we must think of it as an ethno-religion, right? And, I think people use that language in the 21st century too. Christianity differed in this regard, and it's something closer to a modern religion. And even our modern concept of religion, and I'm not going to nerd out on this and channel my inner religious studies scholar and go off on it, but our concept of religion, and even the academic study of religion, is based in post-Reformation Christian thought, right? It's not, when we talk about the world religion paradigm or early scholarship on the academic study of religion, like this is a very post-Reformation Christocentric undertaking and framework for this. Right. So I'm gonna move ahead because I do want to make sure I'm timely here so that we have time to engage the conversation here. At the end of this, I will, because I don't want to be touching my screen and causing some problems here, I'll just wait till I'm done talking. I'll give everyone the link to this debate from 2014. And it speaks to the issues of not only what's the best language to use in antiquity, or accurate language, but what are the contemporary implications of this? So I'm going to discuss Reinhardt's a bit, maybe Mason not as much, since I gave you a big juicy quote from Mason before, and really kind of, Mason's piece in 2007, I think really laid the groundwork for a lot of this conversation. Daniel Schwartz, I mentioned, and Yoshiko Reed, who we'll look at a bit. Jonathan Clowens and Yoshiko Reed are my two favorites in this debate. And we'll just look briefly at James Crossley as well, because he quotes a couple problematic New Testament scholars that really, I think, show that, as historians, we get skin in the game too for contemporary politics, and we'll see some anti-Semitism in some of that scholarship. So just quickly, Adele Reinhardt's of University of Ottawa. I'm not just trying to put as many Canadians in this talk as I can, because I am Canadian. This just happens to be the way we are. I guess we're like scattered murder. We just keep coming back together. So Reed's concern, I'm just going to look at the emboldened italicized part here, that at this very moment at computers across the English-speaking world, there are professors and graduate students tapping out books, articles, and blog posts in which Jew never appears as a designation for Josephus or Philo, Paul, the Pharisees, right? And admittedly, that was me in grad school. Like I said, I got seduced by Mason's piece in 20. I had footnotes in my dissertation about it, being like, oh yeah, this is accurate language. And when, I really changed my view after reading this. I started thinking, with this first entry, like, it's a good point. And as you make your way through this debate, I actually now use the word Jew when I'm teaching my class in this time period. So as a grad student, I was in the Mason school. I no longer am. And Reinhardt's tells us, she's all for historical precision, which Mason's trying to do, but is also sharply attuned to anti-Semitism. And as a scholar and a Jew, is concerned and alarmed about the invisibility of Jews and Judaism in the English translations, and Jews possibly being written out of their own history and texts, which I'll show with the last quotes I show you here. So the use of Judean I'll just stop there. This is Reinhardt's concern, and being concerned about precision, but the ethics of translations, which I think is something, and again, Judith Liu pointed to that as well, that as historians, we just don't have to consider the past, but the present and the future. And especially with some of these asymmetrical histories, and biblical studies doesn't have a great foundation. It's a lot of anti-Semitic root, like when the field emerged, especially, critical studies of the Bible in the late 19th century Germany. So, she is concerned about, confronting this history of anti-Semitism and within, the New Testament. So Mason, I'm not going to spend too much time on this because I already discussed Mason, and I do want to make sure I end here in about 15 minutes. Right, like he's saying, like, well, he doesn't see Jews and Judaism vanishing from the academy, points out that he thinks Jewish studies is actually flourishing right now in ways that it hadn't before, and doesn't think that using the word Judean over Jew is going to cause a lot of issues in that regard. And you can see he's is the concern that when we write about the most famous Jewish author outside the Bible, Josephus, and explore him in detail, right? That you want to, he's not really taking these concerns super seriously, or maybe I shouldn't say that, but again, it's making his point that he's looking for precision, right? And what Mason's most interested in is how ancients organized their knowledge of the world and communicated with each other. And again, here, that he wants to put it in the frameworks of Josephus's contemporaries and contemporaries of this Jewish ancient world, these Roman writers. And he's not saying Jew is incorrect, but thinks, again, with, what I said, like with Josephus and the discourse around against Apion, that, it more aligns to groups like Spartans and Nabateans and Idumeans, Romans, Greeks. And again, Mason thinks like we don't really have to worry that much. Like Jewish studies is flourishing in ways that it hasn't before. And, and wants to make Josephus and Philo and other ancient Jews intelligible to other ancient historians, right? And Josephus and Philo engaged in cultural translations, trying to make Jewish tradition more intelligible to Greeks and Romans themselves, and did a lot of mimicry, which we talked about last week. And, Mason says he's trying to, make this. And, when I got into ancient studies, and especially back in undergrad, talking to classicists, like there's this imaginary line drawn through the Mediterranean. And like, I just studied some weird stuff in the ancient Near East, and they were studying the true classical world. All right, so turning to Yoshiko Reed, who, as I said, I really like. I'm just gonna check this question quickly. All right. So rather than, second, Reed's not going hard one way or the other, but is kind of pointing out the limitations of this debate, and including like our modern ones as well. Yet it, as I mentioned, yet it remains the late antique shifts did not suffice to produce religion as we know it. The genealogy of our current categorization of religion is, modern European colonial context, is, some people call it like post-Reformation, Christian context. And I absolutely agree with Reed here. Judaism has never fit neatly in one category, in the category of religion. And this very misfit, in fact, has spurred much creativity within modern Jewish thought. And I know we have at least one expert here who's, presiding over this, who might be able to speak to this, and probably some others in the audience. Seen from this perspective, it's not surprising that 21st century English term Jew is no more static, set, or stable than the first century Greek term Judaismos, right? And I absolutely do agree with Reed there. And, and the more we like the complexity of this ethno-political discourse of the modern world, right? And, the long, winding prehistories of modern and Western notions of religion, right? And these are anachronistic terms, but we use anachronisms all the time. History, Herodotus coins historia. I said genocide. Like we can talk about social phenomena and things before there is a term. And Reed concludes the very challenge of translating ancient Judeo into modern terms points to the power and limits of the categorization of religion, antiquity and modernity alike. And I'll put my cards on the table. I'm very much into that school. I'm gonna discuss Clowens for a few minutes here, just because I'm giving you a little sample of what's going on in this debate here. And some of the voices, I really like Clowens' piece as well. Clowens is a fantastic scholar. I like much of Clowens' work. Is it really the case that the translation Jew has done great harm? If I'm not mistaken, the questions about Jew and Judean, as it's taking place primarily in an English language context, far be it for me to deny the influence of anti-Semitism in the English-speaking world, and we absolutely have seen a spike in that in the last few years. But points out like that this this maybe isn't the front line of anti-Semitism. Clowens does go into how Russians translate these terms, and speaks to Kishinev and kind of that history as well. So, and also, with academics debating this in an English-speaking context, like how much, what is that going to do for anti-Semitism? Maybe that's something we could think about as well, right? I'm gonna skip over that one. So Clowens tells us too, perhaps I've strayed off course, but this is why I think the anti-Semitism arguments is not just odd, but manipulative. It's a clarion call to take one side of an unsolved issue, Jew or Judean, by appeal to a moral argument, right? And I do enjoy this part. Here's my view: anti-Semites can translate these terms as they wish, and they should go to hell. I agree with that. The rest of us should just have an open conversation about this matter without misleading ourselves into thinking that Jew haters will somehow be countered by academic semantic adjustments. My students tend to agree with this. So without, I fear, not without reason, that some of the anti-Semites just might also find this current revisionism conducive to, their ends. And, and Clowns points out too that, that I'm gonna skip over that part. I'm just gonna go to his conclusion here. So for me, here's the rub. Ostensibly in the name of countering anti-Semitism and other Western Christianity centered biases about religion, we're being asked to suppose that Judeans were some unspecified time transformed into Jews because of the development of Christianity, no quotes needed, which could eventually lead to the invention of Judaism. Possible? Yes. Proven? No. Analytical benefit? Unclear. Moral gain? I don't see one. I do appreciate Clown's honesty in this debate. So I will be, all right, this is going to be perfect timing. So James Crosley has an interesting, I'm not going to get into Crosley's arguments here, but Crosley and his colleague he writes with a lot, Robert Miles, have taken Bruce Molina, who was formerly of Creighton University, worked in the Jesus, and Blake can correct me if I'm wrong, the context group, social scientific approaches to the New Testament and gender, and Richard Rohrbaugh. So here's Crosley quoting them. This is actually, for me, what really changed where I started using the word Jew, kind of engaging some of this scholarship, because I think we do have some moral implications with here. The fact is, from a religious point of view, this is Molina and Rohrbaugh, not Crosley. All modern Jews belong to a tradition developed largely after the time of Jesus. There's that erasure of Jews from their past, compiled in the Babylonian Talmud 6th century. As for ethnic origins, Central European Jews, called Ashkenazi Jews, largely trace their origin to Turkic and Iranian ancestors. So in the Caucasus Mountains, who comprised the Khazar Empire. So this is the Khazar thesis, right, which is anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. And these are big New Testament scholars. Thus, given the 6th century origin of all forms of contemporary Jewish religion, and given the US experience of Jews basically largely on Central European Jews, themselves originating from the 8th century CE converts. So what these guys have done is what Reinhardt's was concerned about: the vanishing Jew, erasing Jews from their history, and especially the homeland, which, all the politics around that, right? And, how that can play out, that, there's no claim to the land of Israel. And you can see that they're legitimately using in their scholarship www.kazaria.com, because again, this is quoting them. They label all Israelis as non-Semitic Central European people of Turkic origins. And Molina was known as, his politics are playing out here. I'll just say that, but the Khazars were a Turkic people who converted to Rabbinic Judaism in the 9th century CE to eventually settle in largely Slavic lands. 84% of all Jews before World War II lived in Poland. They were Khazar Jews. Most Christians derive their image of ancient Semitic Judeans from the images of contemporary non-Semitic Khazar Jews. The point is, there was no lineal development from early Israel to contemporary Khazar Jewishness. Ancient Israelites have little in common with Jews of today, aside from Israel's scriptures, which Christians also share. So yeah, this is, again, what Reinhardt's was concerned about, writing, using ancient concepts to, and this is beyond supersessionism and anti-Judaism. This is, straight up anti-Semitism. I can't really see this quote too great because the bar is in the way. Oops, go back. So, Molina basically says that, we can't say that, there's no way we could say that contemporary Israelis come from, first century Judeans, because like Israelis are, these are not my words, they're rude and ungrateful. And, the first generation Judeans were nothing like this. Like, so you can, it's anti-Semitism. I'm gonna call it what it is. And, so with these categories, like they're messy in antiquity, but there also is things at stake when we talk about these, the contemporary implications with these. I get some of the stuff Clowens was laying down, but how much is English speaking academic banter gonna really do? But we can see this in some scholarship, right? That what Reinhardt's is concerned about, that we can have the vanishing Jew from antiquity, Jews being written out of their own history, and in ways I think that go beyond, they're more insidious actually than supersessionism, which biblical scholarship has had that problem since its emergence, and when we can kind of see what we have at stake here too, with our ethics of translation, our ethics as historians, and being accountable to the past, present, and future. So that is 7:57. I think that's almost exactly when I wanted to end, 2 minutes over. So I'm going to silence myself and go back to the panel and my colleagues here, and open it up to our audience.
Okay, great. Thank you, team. I don't know if you have one more slide about conclusion that you would like to share with us. Time is sufficiently fluid here, but if not, we can get to the questions from our colleagues first. So maybe Francoise, would you like to start with a question, and then Blake?
Sure, thank you so much, team. I mean, Dr. Langille, thank you for this fantastic presentation. This was such a beautiful and convincing case about the dangers of categories, and all the challenges that exist in translation, and using our contemporary words for things of the past. Identities, how people presented themselves, and how difficult it is to put words on those today. So thank you for warning us, against anachronisms, but especially for showing the dramatic implications of those choices today. Not always clear, as you showed, but I mean, that was so beautifully shown, how those choices have repercussions today. I want to leave space to the audience. I was, very interested also in the part of your talk when you discussed the creativity of identity building among the early Christians. What do you think about, I was reminded of a term that I cannot really, I forgot who uses it, but the term disembedding, okay, that the use of religion as disembedded of other markers of identity. and I'm hesitating, is it Boyarin, is it Daniel Schwartz who you uses that? But what do you think of that idea of a disembedding happening, among early Christians, in the way that they shape the identity? Do you find that convincing, or what would you?
Yeah, with identity, I just, with religion, especially, when I tell my students, like, you might be Christian or Jewish, but that might be number 5 identity marker. You might be a soccer mom, a volleyball player, a food blogger, a long distance runner. And, our identities are so composite, right? Like even when you disembed things like these, and identities are always, going back to Frederick Barth with, ethnic identities, right? That, you can hold more than one. Boundaries change, boundaries move.
Mm-hmm.
And I just think these processes are so fluid. Am I getting at the disembedded part?
Yeah.
I don't really, I use the word Jew now,
Mm-hmm.
but I don't really know, kind of within this debate when, it's most appropriate to use, whether it's, 'cause I've just kind of, as much theoretical stuff as there is here, with my students, I just say Jew. I don't really think of it, and I think of it as like kind of like an ethno-religious thing, and I don't. And Blake and I talked about this like earlier today. It's really hard to, extract religion from an ethnic identity, especially at this time period, and trying to. So again, looking for like these pure origins. I'm never, when something firmly starts.
Yeah, can I suggest something here, Tim, for you to reflect on? I agree that origins are there's never one starting point. That's obvious, and the fluidity and the porosity, that's all part of the conversation. But there's one thing that we haven't heard about, and that's the practice of circumcision. So
Right.
Can you say a little bit more about that as a marker of ethnic/religious identity, and the complexity, which Shia Cohen actually has written a lot about, kind of what do we know about the extent of the practice, the stuff that you didn't want to talk about, the Hasmonean imposition of that practice on other groups,
Right.
has something to do with negative and even hostile emotions toward, definitely toward the Hasmoneans, but not only them. So can you explore a little bit more the role of circumcision?
Yeah, and I think Francois, you spoke about that a bit last week as a boundary marker, like that's, or was that Blake? I know, or maybe both of you. I know we had this conversation. Yeah, like this seems to be, this is a boundary marker, and the work even on during those stories of reverse circumcision, right, where you have this being an ethnic boundary marker, right? Like when you get a gymnasium and you have naked people there, you have Jews there, and social capital. You're not going to get much of that in that colonial society by being circumcised, and those stories of reverse circumcision. And I think, Francois, you were talking about this too with boundaries, like circumcision is something we can point to as a Jewish practice. Even the speculation around the Bar Kokhba revolt, that it might have been, that circumcision might have, or misunderstanding of it might have been what started it. So yeah, this is something that, seems like a firm Jewish boundary marker, for an ethnic identity, that I think, Jews were known for in the ancient world.
Blake, would you like to jump in this conversation? Because I have another question, but it's more theological. So I think we should stay more on the ethnic first.
Yeah, I mean, Tim, you said something about Cohen's argument. So Cohen's argument basically, right, is that we can start talking about something like Judaism as a religion, as a result of the Maccabean revolt and the Hasmoneans in the 2nd century BC.
Yeah.
And you said something like you don't totally buy that. So then, like, why and when do you think, like, when would you start speaking of Judaism as a, like, would it be like later in late antiquity and kind of conversation with Christianity like you were talking about, or something else?
Yeah, well, it's that process of, what happened with the Hasmoneans, right? Because the approach, at least, I've been convinced by Weitzman with that is, the Hasmoneans were incredibly unpopular and they faced resistance, and to quell the resistance, it's like playing whack-a-mole by trying to, push back harder and losing popularity amongst, I'll just use the word Jews. They started bringing in, essentially mercenaries from the outside, and Weitzman talks about, this is kind of the codified discourse that we get in First Maccabees with these, with this forced circumcision. Yeah, I haven't, with. Even though I said I used the term Jew, I guess I've been kind of convinced by Mason too that, I often do use Judaizing versus Hellenizing versus Judaism and Hellenism. I can see the strengths of the argument, obviously, right, where you're going from one identity to another with, like boundary markers like circumcision, right? That, one, I guess, could be considered a Jew at that time, right? That this is where we get the shift that you, but, more recent scholarship on ethnic identity, people do change ethnic identities. This is something that happens. Boundaries are fluid. People can hold more than one ethnic identity as well. So I guess that's, where I'd push back on that a little bit. It does make sense to me. Like, I'm not wholesaling, like, it's not a wholesale dismissal of that argument. I understand the premise and where it's coming from. I probably would push it back a little bit later. And I think with Josephus as well, I think against Appian is one thing that maybe has me thinking about it a little bit, later. And kind of the irony too is, when we trace Judaism back to the Hasmoneans, like Judaism kind of forgot about the Hasmoneans as well, because of like what was, like in rabbinic literature, because of, some of the treatment of Jews during that time, right? Like the miracle of light is remembered, but not the figures of the Hasmoneans, right? So it is kind of like an ironic origin as well, right? Because the Hasmoneans weren't. I don't think they were very popular in Jewish memory. In the Common Era, moving forward. What do you think of the theory with Cohen?
I mean, I think it makes a lot of sense, but I'm also, another piece of it that is really interesting, that in his argument is the weight that he gives to the Jewish development of the idea of conversion, just the idea of conversion. And this is something that we should really hammer home to people, is that, like, you do not see conversion in antiquity prior to Jews coming up with this idea. Because religion was so connected to ethnos, to peoplehood, to your people and their way of life and their traditional practices and their laws, it was really kind of, unheard of that a person might go from one ancestral cult to another, right? Because that would defy the sense of it at all. And so I think that one of the quite brilliant things that Shia Cohen has pointed out is this sort of the importance of the Jewish development of the concept of conversion in the context of the broader ancient world, which in itself helped them to solidify this idea of Jewishness as distinct, in some way ethnic, but in some way like beyond ethnic in the way of thinking in the ancient world. And that it is that Christianity picks up on, like when the Jews, right, the Jews who were the Jesus movement, went out to get converts among the nations, among the Gentiles. They were operating within a reality that such a thing was possible, and obviously the way that they went about their conversion was a bit, especially with Paul, is a different kind of thing because of circumcision and law. Torah observance is not part of it. But that's, if people want to learn more about that kind of, about sort of putting the very early Jesus movement within this context, like especially when it comes to Jewish conversion, I would recommend Paula Fredrickson's new book, Paul, the Pagan's Apostle, which is fantastic, and really helps, I think, to give us a good, solid rethinking of Paul and the very, very early decades of the followers of Jesus in the context of Second Temple Judaism. So I know that's a long, sorry, that's a long answer.
No. And it's just something that came to mind too, because we're I think it was last week we were discussing, right, martyrdom literature is somewhere where Boyar and Lou and others would map a parting of ways, right, where you have Christians dying and saying, like, I'm a Christian, Jews saying the Shema, and Second Maccabees, right, Eliezer, Razis, right, like they are dying for Judaismos, right, and how that becomes a framework for later martyrdom literature, and even the Passion narratives. And so there might be going back to Second Maccabees, that's where we get like how Judaismos factors in that. And so I hear what you're saying, like at this time, like something going on with conversion, but also this kind of prototypical martyrdom stuff that we get in Second Maccabees, where people aren't just fighting on behalf of Judaismos, they're dying for it, right? You're gonna set a good example for the youth that you die for this tradition. And then Razi's scene, right, like that, you can see Christian offshoots from that literature. But conversion is it's interesting, the circumcision stuff with conversion and what exactly is going on in reality, and then what the text is, what's going on in the social world perhaps, and what's going on in the text. So I don't want to jettison.
But let's not forget, this is where theology comes in. That's exactly the point, and it's very relevant to Paul, because what Paul is doing, even Alan Siegel wrote the book Paul the Convert, but it's not that he's converting from A to B, right? He's not first something and then some. What's happening is much more complex, and that goes back to the lecture of Blake about how it all relates to the interpretation of the text. So what is this spiritual circumcision as opposed to circumcision of the flesh? What is this new creation? So the whole point of the role of faith, especially faith in Christ, that's the kind of a transformative event that really creates a new discussion that goes beyond ethnicity, beyond boundaries, beyond the flesh, into something else. That's why the kind of theoretical complexity of this situation is almost, I would say, mind-boggling to the people at the time and to us who try to understand what was going on. So who is Paul? Is Paul 1 foot here and 1 foot there? Or is Paul really he maybe created a new kind of a game, a new interpretive schema, actually. That's how I see.
You know, Hava, there's actually Fredrickson argues in this book, Paul, that Paul, so her argument is that Paul was actually a Jew so we know that there were some Jews who were not actually comfortable with the idea of conversion in Antiquity still at this point, that conversion had not become universally accepted. And so she argues that actually Paul's stance on circumcision of Gentiles, and she's clear, he's talking specifically to and about Gentiles, that his stance is because he didn't believe in conversion. He didn't believe, as a Pharisee of his particular tradition, that it was possible for Gentiles to convert to Judaism. And so then when he had this apocalyptic idea of the death and resurrection of Jesus initiating the new age, the age to come is here, he, not believing in conversion of Gentiles as a possibility, then basically conceives of a way for Gentiles to be included as basically following the laws of Noah, right? The Noahide laws, where they don't need to be circumcised because circumcision would imply that they're converting, and that, in her argument, Paul didn't think they could convert to Judaism. And so, of course, they don't need to live by the Torah because they can't be Jews. And so this is kind of a sort of radical new approach to Paul and to early the very earliest Christianity that's sort of being discussed right now. And I think it's really interesting because it helps maybe us to think about the kind of, to place even the most radical elements of early Christianity within some kind of Jewish framework, rather than being these sort of totally new inventions.
You said that was Fredrickson's new book?
Yeah.
I don't know that book. Yeah, I don't know that book either. That's a good thing to read.
Come by the office and you can borrow it.
All right.
All right. So let's look at some Q&A from the audience. We have 2 questions from the same person. Can you look at it, please?
Yeah, in English and probably in all languages, concepts such as religion, race, and ethnicity have never been well defined, and their subsets such as Jews and Christians even less well defined. If that is true, how should we use these concepts to better understand the psychological and social identities of individuals who believe that they are part of these groups? Oh, that's a good question. That's
and then the follow-up.
In ancient times, to what extent was religion tied to location? When did religion become portable? That's kind of going back to what we're just talking about with the conversions, right? But then also diaspora, right? Because again, when I first read Mason back in the day, that was something that popped in my head, like, what about Philo? What about these Greek-speaking Jews who their education, their entertainment, right, going to the theater, their the way they drew off of Moses as well, being like, Moses never entered the homeland, the Holy Land, right? That you can have, we had Jews throughout the ancient Mediterranean, and that kind of goes back to what Mason was saying, that, I guess you can be a Judean Egyptian, right? That you could be like a Persian American, or maybe there is something in this time period, and where we do see maybe a conceptual shift, right? Like if we go back to Cohen, a lot of things are changing at this time. Just, Blake, what you're talking about with conversions or these martyrdom things, conceptual shifts in the afterlife as well, during this period that, this period to which, Cohen's working off of is, we do get a lot of shifts and change at this time. And I think religion absolutely, and again, I'm okay with using the word religion. I know it's tied into ethnicity, but I do think we can call things names before, that term actually exists. And, and I think that would be something that would unite, Jews around the Mediterranean. Like you don't need to be in Jerusalem, Palestine to be a Jew. I think it is, and Blake, what you're talking about with that conversion process, maybe that's part of that as well.
But you do need to refer to the Torah. You do need to read the biblical text and interpret the biblical text. So all of these people have some relationship.
Yeah, it can be in Greek, but it's still like, that's the miracle of the translation, that it's the perfect copy of the Hebrew, right? That the miracle of that translation in the letter of Aristeas, right? That they brought in the 72 translators, and by miracle, they all had the perfect carbon copy of, Hebrew Torah, but they're Greek, right? And yeah, because there are identity markers, right? Because you can live in Alexandria, but still care about the temple. Like Philo's a very good example of that, right? That Philo might not live in the homeland, but has an eye to it. And, those identity markers, Torah, circumcision, dietary, calendar, whatever, we look at with, this identity. And you're right, that's what unites people. And again, just how intimately intertwined religion and ethnicity are. I'm okay with using the word religion, but this is what unites people, and that's what Jews are known to for, like Hecateus of Abdera, like, oh, Moses, Torah, Jerusalem, Jews, right? Like that there were these identifiable identity markers. I think we got another question. And panelists, if you want to.
And their lack of participation, like the fact that Jews didn't participate in the sacrificial cults in the cities in which they lived in the diaspora, also made them seem idiosyncratic to people, and stand out in a way, that might lead, for example, to a massacre in Alexandria in the 1st century. Because of this sense in which they were part of the city, but they weren't fully part of it because they didn't participate in all the civic rituals.
Had their citizens stripped by the Romans, right?
Yeah.
And for these, and you could see too with what the Roman, with that event, and also trying to put imperial statues in the temple, right? Like they knew how to get to the heart of a Jewish identity or something that would. So yeah, there are clear like shared identity markers. And
so we have a question about the hyphenated identities. Can you look at it?
Yes, we've got a question about, do hyphenated identities ever appear in these ancient or classical texts? Not that I can think of. Blake or Francois?
The question is, what is presupposed in the hyphenated? Is it hyphen of ethnicity or something else? Because we do have some gray categories. If so, maybe that what the person that what Mr. Bernstein has in mind.
Well, and I think also I've just been going off on the hyphenated identities, like Mason says, like you don't need a religious signifier. Like you can be like a Judean citizen of Alexandria, or you can be a Judean Egyptian, and just the way we hyphenate in contemporary times, right? Whether it's Indo-Canadian or Persian American.
But what about the God-fearing people? Are they hyphenated? It's not an ethnic identity. It's a kind of a religious or spiritual identity. Yet it's neither here nor there. It's somewhere in the middle. And we know that there was such a group. And we know that Paul tried to make a case to this group, and probably quite successfully.
Well, hybrids, right? Like when things interact there, and the more, like in following Bruno Latour, like the more you try to eliminate hybrids, the more you produce, right? Like that's kind of the, catch-22 of it, right? That people who look for purity and don't want hybrids actually create more hybrids. And yeah, like there's a lot of, I don't know if I want to use the word liminality or liminal space, but these are, like Francois showed so beautifully last week, right? Just the messiness of these things, the overlap, the wave theory, and we've got, it's on a spectrum of some kind and there's a lot of overlap in that.
Also, I mean, just to shift a little bit our focus from literature to archaeology, tombstones, the inscriptions of tombs are also very interesting. So because some of them combine symbols, quite a few combine symbols or name of deities from different traditions. For example, naming both, the Jewish God, but also Roman deities on one single stone.
Right.
So that's not really an hyphenated identity per se, but at least it's kind of this, complex religious allegiance that we see there. Also, what I wanted to say, we have this, then going back to literature, this conviction that is expressed in several texts, from Philo to Third Maccabees to Greek Esther, that Jews have to contribute by the prayer to the well-being of the people among which they live, that the prayer contributes to the stability of that nation and to the role of the king, of the foreign king, which, I mean, it could be a response to anti-Jewish discourses, to anti-Jewish hostility, suspecting, the Jews of a double loyalty. But I think that if it's there in the text, it can also be, a profound sense of, in fact, contributing to the political power of that nation. I think there are other questions.
Yeah, there's a couple more. Were folks other than Jews viewed as other in ancient? Yes, Alexandria, right? Like Egypt, Philo and Josephus were. It's not even like a proximate other. I think they try to make the Egyptians into like the ultimate other, right? And that was with the, trying to translate Jewish culture into like, hey, you got the law of nature. We've got Torah, which is the perfect copy of it. Those Egyptians over there, they worship crocodiles. Like, look at our great lawgiver Moses. Look at our Torah, the way, and that was also in response to, Jews and Egyptians battling it out for the bottom, right? When Jews lost their citizenship in Alexandria under the Romans, right? And, so this process of creating, Jews tried to show mimicry or present themselves in a certain way to Romans at the expense of the Egyptians, right? Because there was a real tension there, and I think, and Josephus wasn't shy with, and against Appian to show like, hey, like, look how awesome we are. I think this othering process, happens with a lot of, identity formation, and
Mhm.
sometimes it's approximate others, sometimes, groups can be turned into the ultimate other, for lack of better terms. So yeah, I would say definitely there's folks other than Jews as other in the ancient cities.
Yeah, by the time you get to the 2nd century, I mean, it's clearly Christians, the answer to that question, because I mean, Christians are seen often by the Roman pagans as not being fully Jewish in the ways that they would approve of, because while Jews were other, right, they, at least for the Romans, were part of an ancient tradition that had deep roots, and there was nothing the Romans loved more than tradition. I always tell my students, like, Rome State University's motto would have been #1 in tradition.
Yeah.
Because they're not into innovation, and so Christians were suspect immediately because they rejected the traditions of the Jews.
Yeah, that was their street cred, for lack of better terms, right? Like, why do you want to get rid of that nice, long, ancient backstory, right? Like that's what gives you,
that's what gives you credibility.
Yeah, that's what gave you credibility. Yeah, we talked about that in my office today with just this is, the Romans were bewildered with.
Yeah, Celsus, the Roman writer, in his against the Christians in the 2nd century, says to Christians, it's incumbent on every people to live according to the ancestral laws of their people, and to follow their rites and traditions. Christians have abandoned the ancestral rights of their people by coming from all nations and becoming this group. And they, to make it even worse, they don't even live according to the laws of the Jews, which they claim to follow. So Celsus is like, they are basically, Christians are basically a problem on multiple fronts.
Yeah.
Because
Why do you want to separate from this nice story that gives you your
and the rituals and you don't participate. The Jews, we understand why they don't participate in the rituals of the city, but you Christians are not a people. So you can't just opt out of being an Athenian or an Alexandrian,
right?
And the Christians said, yes, we can. So I mean, it all I think gets at some of the most fundamental divides for, why were Christians persecuted by the Romans? That's why.
Yeah.
They also didn't they Christians refused to serve in the army, didn't they? So the lack of the willingness to serve in the army is a big reason.
So I mean, I know this is impossible for us to conceive of now, right? With very conservative evangelical Christianity, but Christians are basically completely unpatriotic in these societies where they live. That's how they would have been perceived, as borderline traitors to their country. And
all the voids they filled, right? Their Christianity did not fall, it didn't follow, and especially with trying to separate from Jews whenever we trace that. But good. We got another question.
Last question, maybe if you can look at it.
I've got it, and it's a big one. Discussions of Judaism and race have been recently in the news. That is very true. You see that in Jewish Forward. As a Black person who grew up with knowledge of Ethiopian Jews in Black American synagogues, headed by a convert, my perception has been Jewish as a religion. I've also held a close relationship with Jewish cultural centers in the US, which happen to be headed by Ashkenazi or white Israeli descendants, and have never heard of Jewish as race identity. There were large discussions in the 1990s and early aughts from Jewish racialized groups that Judaism is not a race, but a religion in response to outsiders' collective identification of them as a racial group. Of course, we know of the perverse World War II German definitions, but outside of this, how and when did these two conflate in modern recent history, as there was a deliberate attempt to delineate? Well, that's a good. Well, I would say, contemporary Judaism, it's messy like ancient Judaism, right? That, you got Jews who don't practice what we'd call the traditional tenets of it, right? But are, ethnically Jewish, but you can have converts, people who aren't born Jewish who become, Jewish. And even what it means to be Jewish, like the Pew studies, like even like, I've just recently taught the 2020 study, and like the 2014 one or 2013 of American Jews, and I guess it might have been 2015 one of Israeli Jews, the number one identity marker for Jews is remembering the Holocaust, then being intellectually curious, being a good person, having a sense of humor was on par with supporting Israel, and then going to temple, keeping kosher, and what we'd consider the traditional tenets of religion were all down at the bottom. And, being a Jew, there's different identity, and going back to World War II, like the Nazis absolutely racialized religion. Not only did they have their racial hierarchies, but they, we get past anti-Judaism once we get to anti-Semitism, because it becomes racialized, right? Because it's not converting you can't convert the Jew anymore. There's something essential about a Jew that even Luther said that in the 16th century, that can't change a Jew, especially with his, profoundly, I would actually maybe start using the word anti-Semitic there. Like all you can do is drown them in the baptismal font. And how the Nazis had this hierarchy of, Christianities that were racialized, right? Like, African and Asian Christianity be at the bottom. Judaism absolutely became racialized, but of course it was pseudoscience, so that didn't really work. So they actually, for the Nuremberg laws, had to go back to the old school anti-Judaism and go back to how religious, one's grandparents were. And there's some really interesting conversations, especially post-summer 2020, talking about Blackness in Judaism, Black experiences in Jewish communities. And so I think Judaism can be a lot of different things, and for different people. And I'm definitely not a gatekeeper for who and what is a Jew. And I think Jews are dynamic, diverse, and especially American Judaism. Like I always tell my students, like, don't even try to generalize about that. It's I think it can be, and there are some very interesting conversations in the book that I use for Intro to Judaism. I showed at the beginning that Judaism's Aaron Hunt Tapper's book, Jake Tapper's brother, actually does a really good job kind of engaging these conversations. And I find, this is what the students want, like in a Intro to Jewish Civ course or an Intro to Judaism class. But the way we talk about a lot of these things, I think we're hopefully starting to have different conversations about race and anti-Blackness in America in general. And Jews come from everywhere. That's Professor T. Roche Samuelson always says that, like, Jewish history is world history, right? There's nowhere you can.
Yeah, but there's one book that we can bring to mind in this particular moment, and that's Shaul Magid's book on post-ethnic Judaism.
Okay.
So post-ethnic, which is a category that this guy, I forgot his name, is in UCLA. I forgot his name of that scholar who's not Jewish, but he created that category of post-ethnic, and in a sense. We have to figure out something is different now in the 21st century. So the book that you showed that you use with your students, Judaisms in the plural.
Yeah.
probably in the early 20th century, we wouldn't use that term in the plural or before, even though Judaism always was diverse, always was complex. So complexity was always there, but yet there's something today in a postmodern environment that allows people to be more accepting of this kind of diverse. It's not just diversity, it's plurality. So what we have is Judaism in the plural form. So,
Yes,
but
and
that's a good question that the person has just raised.
And one thing I'll add, because you mentioned Shaul Magid, is article from, I think it was last year, Judeo-pessimism on anti-Semitism and Afro-pessimism, right? So like we are having very different conversations at this moment than we were before. And, you know, I think that's exciting for Jewish studies that we're, you know, kind of engaging these conversations. And but yeah, no, I appreciate that question. That's
so that's a nice way to kind of end this wonderful seminar, shall we call it, in which we touch on the complexity of being Jewish today. I would like to bring to your attention actually that tomorrow, Professor Jonathan Fox from Bar-Ilan University is going to speak about a topic that goes directly to the conversation we had tonight. The title of his talk is, "Why do people discriminate against Jews?" So it's really amazing how those two talks came one after the other. And this is also available on Zoom as well as available in person. So if you're not sure about the details of the event, please go to our website where you can find more information. And next Tuesday, we're going to host yet another guest lecturer, Professor David Kurtzer from Brown University, who will speak about the silence of Pope Pius XII and the SS roundup of some of Rome's Jews. So here is an example how all those, the ancient issues and the contemporary issues really have a unique continuity. And maybe that continuity in and of itself is what it means to be Jewish. Is that continuity, the fact that you relate to certain cultures, certain texts, certain issues. That's probably what it is to be Jewish, this notion of continuity. So thank you all for joining us. And I hope you learned a lot from this series, and we will continue to do those very enlightening lectures to anybody who would like to study. So I appreciate your participation and wish you all good night.
Thank you.